So what was life like here, say, in 1700 AD? Well, first of all, we can ask sort of what would you have spoken? And the answer is that you would have spoken, if you lived here 1700 years ago here in Kenai Peninsula or Anchorage or Matsu, you would have been speaking Dena'ina. You would have been speaking one of several different dialects of Dena'ina, like Outer Inlet, Inland, Iliamna, Upper Inlet. They should also have Soldovia. That's sometimes considered its own dialect. But you would have been speaking one of those languages. It's a very complex and beautiful language that you can actually still learn in a variety of different ways, not the least of which is taking courses at KPC or UAA from some of our excellent Dena'ina language instructors who I cannot say enough good things about. By the way, I ask students sometimes when I do this class, like name this bird, and they'll tell me what they think it's called. And then I'll say, gotcha, and I'll think I'm very clever because it's actually two different birds that look a lot the same, the hermit thrush and the Swenson's thrush. And they're called in Dena'ina, Kentuchila, and Shinrash. And I say that partly so that you can hear a little bit of what Dena'ina sounds like, albeit through my very imperfect pronunciation, but also because I want you to know how precise the language is in talking about wildlife, not just things that are eaten or have practical uses, quote unquote, but also all sorts of different wildlife. Dena'ina has a very rich vocabulary for talking about the animals and plants in our areas. By the way, the GG is more of like a guttural G in the back of your throat. The apostrophe here, if you're like, I don't know what to do with that. What that is a glottal stop. So say the word bottle and now say it like a British person, bottle. Well, specifically like a South London person. Anyways, that's a glottal stop. We don't do them too often in English, but it's kind of like your vocalization goes boop, boop. Kentuchila. So we could do that again here. And once again, we have two birds that look a lot like each other, but have different names in Dena'ina. Vaja for herring gull and Vachka for glaucous wing gull. Interestingly, the herring gull in Dena'ina, that basically means like salmon gull, so or like fish gull. So actually the English and Dena'ina names are pretty similar in that way. And then finally this guy, which once again, I'm tricking you, two different birds, the chickadee, the boreal chickadee and the black-capped chickadee. But the boreal chickadee is known as Chulashla, which sounds a little bit like the sound they make. It sounds as much like their sound as chickadee does. And one of the interesting things about that, among other things, is that in Dena'ina, so in English, right, if we want to talk about a chickadee, we call it a chickadee, and a seagull, we call it a seagull. But if we want to talk about birds in general, we just say birds. In Dena'ina, traditionally, the way you would usually say like birds wouldn't be to just say like some new word that covers all of them. It's instead you say chakapashla, you say like chickadee. So chickadee is like the umbrella term for all of the birds. And then you have specific terms for like things that aren't chickadees, of course. But if you want to just talk about like generically birds, you would just say like chakapashla, or at least in some of the dialects. Same with like fish, you could say shika, in some of the, or hoka in some of the dialects, and that would be like your generic for like fish. Is salmon, and so that tells you the importance of salmon, right, in Dena'ina life traditionally. Why would chickadee be like your prototypical bird? Why not seagulls, which there's so many around here, bald eagles? One anthropologist, Alan Boris, who you'll hear me mention quite a bit in this lecture because he did a lot of research with Dena'ina language and culture, he liked to say, and I'm not sure where he got this from, but it makes as much sense as any explanation, that chickadees are considered like little friends because they stick around for the whole winter. And so that's why they got to be like the honor of being like the prototypical bird. But anyways, interesting. By the way, for mammals, or brown bear, that's like a general catch-all term for mammals. All right, so that's a little bit about the language that you would be speaking. Dena'ina is also a polysynthetic language, which means that it has incredibly complicated verbs that can do a lot of different things, but we don't need to go into that right now. But suffice it to say, your language would be rich and varied and very complex. And most likely, or very possibly, you would also speak other native languages to speak to people that are, 4 villages over. Like a lot of Dena'ina people would have been able to speak Atna, for example, which is the language of the Copper River people just outside of Anchorage. Next question, how would you have made a living if you lived here 300 years ago? And the answer is by gathering plants, of course, and also by eating fish. This is a chart from a book called Ethnography of the Dena'ina, which is how we used to spell Dena'ina in English. And the study is imperfect, in part because the person who did it only spoke to a few people from each of the communities he spoke to. So take it with a grain of salt. But he made a chart, this Osgood guy made a chart of all the different like fish that people talked about eating in the early 1900s, or that they remembered people eating when they were kids. And basically what I want you to get from this chart is just the many, many different types of fish that people were eating, and things like beluga and things like crabs and seal and clams, right? People were very diverse in what they were eating, and people had delicacies and things that they liked better than other things, and people had to have complex ways of catching these different animals, which behave very differently from each other. So for example, do I talk about it later? Okay, I talk about it later, so I won't get into it yet. By far and away, though, the most important resource, at least where I'm at in Kenai River area, would have for eating the most important wildlife species. Man, you can hear me kind of like falling into that language that we use in English, resource. But anyways, the most important relative or animal that we would have been eating 300 years ago would have been salmon, as indeed continues to be a very important food here on the Kenai Peninsula, and certainly in Anchorage also would have been quite important, particularly around the Connecticut area. Dena'ina people traditionally used a lot of traps, such as these long ones, and as well as like weirs, like these kind of conical shaped ones that would have used like spruce root as a, you can use like pull root out and like turn it into like a twine, like a rope. And then also, I think it was alder poles. Yeah, it was alder poles that would have been shaped to make these weirs, among other things. So these are obviously very effective ways of catching salmon. Another thing that people would do is this kind of like, for lack of a better word, like large basket trap, where you would have, or gate trap, where fish would swim into, like, let's say a stream on their way up to breed, and then you would catch them, and like basically the adult men in the community would spear them or net them in this little enclosure, and then vault it over to the side, where then other members of the community would gut, clean, and prepare the fish, and then eventually smoke them if needs be, or otherwise prepare them for eating and or storage. With a division of labor, as far as we can tell, between men, women, and boys and girls and elders. By the way, it was obviously not just fish, but there was really just, you would have been using all sorts of genius strategies to catch animals, to eat on land as well. Moose, for example, have a good sense of smell, and they can spook easily when you're trying to hunt them. So historically, people would have done this kind of like looping motion, where they're avoiding being upwind of the moose so that the moose doesn't smell them. And it's also based on knowing where the moose tends to bed down. So you're doing loops along its usual path to where it tends to bed down. And then once you no longer see its tracks, you know that you're in front of it, and now you loop back the other direction, find it while it's laying down, and it's easier to hunt. Or you have like halibut fishing, where you would take a smaller fish, put it on a pole that's then anchored by a rock, tide comes in, halibut eats that, tide goes out, halibut is stuck. Or a catfish tackle like this that has a weight that brings it down to the bottom. People, this was not some sort of hand-to-mouth, desperate, people didn't know what they were doing kind of existence. People had very sophisticated ways of using their technology and their materials to catch the animals that they needed to survive, and to procure the plants that they needed to survive. There's other examples that we could share, right? We could multiply the examples. So for example, seals. What's one of the problem with seals? Well, you're trying to hunt a seal, they're going to jump back into the ocean and be like, peace out, humans. This is a flipper, a seal flipper, peace out, humans, right? So historically, at least according to one source, what Dena'ina people would do would be to swim, like enter the ocean quite a ways away from the seal, and like swim along in the ocean, and then approach the seal from the beach side, so that instead of, so now the seal, like, right, you're like guarding the beach side, right? So the seal like is trying to run towards the ocean, but like you're coming up from the ocean, so it's easier to catch at least one. And then I can't remember what I wanted to say about belugas. But belugas were hunted. Beavers would have been tracked, among other things, by dogs who oftentimes were being fed fish, like salmon fish and stuff like that, as their food. But anyways, they would then corner beavers, and would be able to catch beavers in that way by like catching them in their dens. So there's all sorts of like really good solutions to finding animals to sustain life. Although we think of Dena'ina often as like a really heavily fishing people, and indeed that's a big reason why villages are located where they were, oftentimes towards the coast, towards rivers. They also, if you were here 300 years ago, would have noticed that people were hunting all sorts of land mammals. By my count from one study that I was reading, that Osgood study, there was like 20 different land mammals. Some of these are up for debate, particularly bears. So I would take that with a grain of salt. And some of these were mainly for their fur, such as ermine and foxes. And actually, so this number, by the way, since I messed up the bullet points a little bit, it should be closer to like 18. But the point is, there was a variety of different animals that people were eating. There is even one in one very specific source, and I'm not sure whether it's true or not, because it is from literally one person, but there is a claim that eider ducks were even cultivated where you would like get them as a baby and then raise them up. And so the point is, people had a very elaborate way of staying alive and surviving and thriving. Salmon was certainly very centered to that. And indeed, many feel that salmon were kind of the linchpin of what we come to think of as Dena'ina villages, because traditionally Athabascan groups around the state prior to colonialism, a lot of Athabascan groups did a lot more moving around. It was within a territory. It's not as if people didn't have their territory and home base, but there would have been more moving around, following different animal and plant species, whereas Dena'ina people did some of that, especially in the winter, like winter hunting parties, but a lot of like building up these like large villages right on the coast or right on the rivers. And generally speaking, the interpretation is that that was for salmon, right? The salmon made this abundant resource that you didn't sort of have to trek out to the hills to go get, that it would come to you, right? As long as you find the right place, a salmon's going to come to you every single year up that creek or up that stream. So salmon sort of changed everything. All right, I'm going to pause there.